This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus. It's episode 766. This week we've got Dr. Ralph Moon and Jeremy Beagle. We're going to talk about post-remediation verification after a flood or sewage loss. Before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They're the reason we can do the show. Don't forget, after the show, continue the conversation on afterthoughts.iaqradio.com. IAQ Radio's marquee sponsor is the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification, IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry at iicrc.org. IAQ Radio Association sponsors are the Restoration Industry Association, RIA, at restorationindustry.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA, at eia-usa.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are Particles Plus at particlesplus.com. Tramex Meters at tramexmeters.com. EMSL Analytical Inc. at emsl.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick at cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to report that Danny Goff, Yadkinville, North Carolina, was first to identify Hurricane Katrina as the hurricane that had the greatest financial impact on the United States. Here's today's IAQ Radio Trivia question. If you look around, you've seen a lot of flags at half-mast because former Vice President Dick Cheney passed away this week. At the 2004 annual Senate class photo, in an exchange with Senator Patrick Leahy, Vice President Dick Cheney dropped an F-bomb on the Senate floor. Name the journalist who wrote an opinion piece in favor of the use of the word, which was published in the Washington Post. Back to you, Joe.
All right. Jeremy Beagle is Senior Principal Scientist and CIH with SDII Global, having over 18 years of experience performing causation assessments pertaining to moisture, fungal growth, and other indoor environmental issues in the built environment. He also provides expert witness testimony. Jeremy is currently the first vice president of the Indoor Air Quality Association and a vice chair for the IICRC S530 Mold Assessment Standard.
Ralph Moon, PhD, is a building scientist with more than 42 years of consulting experience in the areas of duration of loss studies, material testing, risk assessment, project management, industrial hygiene, and indoor quality assessment. Dr. Moon has published over 60 peer-reviewed and 40 technical articles and papers and is a frequent expert witness on insurance-related claims and projects. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
Good to have you both. Hey, guys, we're talking about post-remediation verification after floods and sewage loss this week. Before we get into Dr. Moon's presentation, I want to ask both of you, in your experience, and maybe Cliff can jump in on this too, how often is this even done? I mean, how often do you get PRV after a flood or after after a sewage-related event?
Go ahead, Jeremy.
In my experience in the insurance services realm, we don't see it a whole lot. I think, you probably see it more in medical facilities or something, that nature. But for a lot of residential and even commercial work, we don't see it. We're not requested to do it much, not like you would with a mold PRV.
Mm-hmm. So you see it more often in mold related cases.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Moon, how about you?
I think I might see it more frequently. In fact, I've just got a new case that accuses a remediation company of not doing complete restoration and a PRV evaluation. So it's less frequent, but I think that it's something that's really helpful if you have something as serious as a sewage loss and there's potential threat to life or health, that you should perform it. Now, is it done very often? I find it's done superficially, meaning that there may be a walkthrough, one tape lift or one swab, one air sample, and that seems to be enough to satisfy a lot of people who do insurance work. But it's not a comprehensive evaluation like we'll talk about today.
Have you guys run into it like schools or I guess more schools? There's a lot of school work out there. Do you see it much there?
That's where I think it's probably most often requested is when there's children involved. There's a student teacher parent committee that oversees some of the work. That's quite frequent, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right, well, let's go in. Go ahead.
No, I think that, I agree with both what Jeremy and Ralph said. There are some high profile situations, if you get a celebrity or someone like that, it's probably going to be done.
I guess the other issue becomes is insurance going to pay for it?
My answer would be yes, because I see the bills that are submitted to the contractor, the consultant that does the work. And they usually range between, say, $1,800 and $3,000 for a PRV.
Interesting. Well, let's go into the presentation you put together on doing it. If you're going to do a PRV, let's do it right. And Dr. Moon, you put together a nice presentation for us. Grayson, can you put up the first slide for us? There we go.
There we go.
All right. So this is on post-remediation verification after a flood or sewage loss. Let's go to the next slide, Grayson.
Yeah, now keep in mind the context of this presentation. I'm not talking about a toilet overflow or some mold behind a kitchen sink. I'm talking a catastrophic failure, because the criteria and the elements I'll talk about are pretty detailed. But where there's been a massive flood or overflow or a catastrophic weather event that has caused a wide variety of structures to be affected. And so if you are the professional, the environmental professional that's going to do this work, you should have some questions before you begin. And I realize that most often when you're asked to do a PRV, it's kind of after the fact. There's been an event, there's been some cleanup, and then you're asked to participate in a PRV. That's not always the case. If it's something that was anticipated, or a very large area has been affected, you might be on a team, and you might become more familiar with the elements of contamination before you do your PRV. But the questions you might ask are listed here. I think the underlying theme of the work you do prior to inspection is trying to get some sense of cooperation and understanding among the parties. Because as you perform a PRV, I think the last thing you want to do is conclude that it passed and some people are not happy with the methods of sampling, or it failed and there's a requirement for the restoration contractor to go back and repeat his work. So if you can get the team, meaning the business owners, members of the restoration team, yourself, to talk, at least have one meeting and talk about the expectations of cleanup and the expectations that you are going to perform for the PRV, that'd be really helpful to diminish frustration and conflict at the end of the effort. And these are the topics you'll talk about. I don't read slides, but you can read those slides and you can see the elements that are important to know before you begin and during the course of the investigation. Next slide.
Go ahead. Next slide, Grayson.
So I had the privilege of traveling with Pete Consigli on behalf of the Restoration Industry Association a year ago last May to Australia and do a number of lectures on behalf of RIA. And during that, we found out the first city we went to was Melbourne. And this is an absolutely beautiful river-bordered city that rose some 20 feet around the perimeter and contaminated a wide variety of businesses, which are listed on the right. And what struck me when they spoke about how devastating it was how every individual business had different needs. I mean, the medical facilities had different needs than, say, uh, parking garage. The theaters, the museums, they were all much different in terms of the requirements for cleanup and what was acceptable to allow people back in. So this experience was kind of the impetus um, to write the paper, to give a perspective about some of the frustrations and planning that have to go into a proper, not only restoration, but a PRV when you're done, and how to bring the parties together to avoid conflict. So
Rob,
next slide. Go
Rob,
ahead.
let me ask you before we go on, what, I mean, I'm trying to think of a standard or a guideline or something for doing this type of thing. Does AIHA have anything or any other groups?
Well, I don't think that it's a detailed evaluation for most of us. And Jeremy and I worked together for years. At the beginning of this work, it was pretty simple. You go to the facility, you look for extra debris. Was it still wet? Did you figure out the source and did you stop it? Was there visible mold? Was it removed? It might be a 4 or 5 step process to pass, plus the sampling to move on off the PRV to get an acceptable restoration remediation effort. But I don't recall a detailed evaluation for comprehensive losses like you might have with a massive river overflow or sewage loss. Jeremy, any thoughts?
I think a lot of it comes from municipalities. The EPA gives some guidance on uh, flood exposure, things like that. But when it comes to what's considered clean, from a post-remediation perspective, you're still going to generally be focusing on the physical aspects of it. With anything, whether you're doing mold or any type of contamination, is did they actually get it clean? And then if you do utilize sampling, you're going to have criteria. And as Ralph has pointed out, which is really critical to these, is that you have to get people to agree, like, this is the criteria, this is what we're looking for, because that's where you will be challenged. So I think when it comes to these sewage losses, things like that, your guidance is generally coming from university, from municipalities, which is remove the bulk, remove the solids, clean and disinfect.
Okay, let's go to
The
the
next
next
slide.
slide.
So before you begin, there's some basic things you want to identify before you enter into one or more structures, and that's make sure that you have proper access and there's appropriate ventilation depending upon the circumstance of the loss. That I mean, you're there for the PRV. Hopefully things are in pretty good shape at this point. You don't have a lot of nuisance odors. There's no pooled water on the floor. All those things would be consistent with almost an immediate failure if you were to start your PRV and you had all these problems. But I think the underlying theme is that before you render an opinion that quickly, be sure to document it in terms of the number of rooms, the things you saw, use photographs and so forth, and make sure that you have some way to document your opinions if they were to radically change to a failure right away upon entry. That's not the way most go, but nonetheless, you want to use these tools to recognize when there could be a problem. Next slide. So one of the first elements of a PRV is a moisture survey, and that's assuming that you've entered the structure or structures and there's no visible pooling of water, no excess moisture that seems to be apparent. And of course, if there's water involved, but the sources have been controlled, they've been removed from the equation. So it's suggested, I think, to conduct these surveys at least 24 hours or more after final drying, because there could be residual moisture, especially in concrete. It's difficult to dry, as with other materials. There are a number of instruments. I use Tramex exclusively for the last 25 years for my work, for their penetrating and non-penetrating meters, but there are others. But I find that if you can do a survey and plot out the moisture results on a floor plan, that's really helpful and instructive, especially if you have to explain that things aren't dry enough. And so in almost all my jobs, I do a floor plan and detailed moisture survey, quantifying all the values so I can show that to my client or to an interested party, and they can see clearly where the highs and lows are associated with the work. If you can find your dry standards, that's of course really important. I like to have that as a control, is find an area that was not affected, basically show my meters are working properly, but there is a reference. So I plot that out, and I find that instructive, and I would encourage that for any type of clearance or PRV when you involve moisture.
All right, let's go to the next slide, Grayson.
This is an interesting topic, and it revealed during the course of the paper, it revealed that there are concerns about the use of disinfectants, which are fundamental in kind of as part of the PRV process. They are to be accompanied by meticulous and thorough cleaning. They are not the method of cleaning, they're the method of disinfecting. Once you've really done a good job in removing contaminant mass, soil, and debris, and so forth. So what struck me, first, there's a variety you can use. Chlorine bleach is very common. Quaternary ammonium materials are as well. But I think what struck me in terms of the long view of the PRV process is the potential liability when the disinfectants are misapplied. And I know that's not kind of first on your list to be concerned about, but there's a wide variety of qualified people that work in this business. And if you're going to be applying disinfectants that might have some health effects, you want to make sure you're following a specific plan in terms of the concentration, rate of application, and so forth. But I think that that's a question that the PRV person should ask. I can see that this is very clean, and I'm about ready to conduct my sampling. When were the disinfectants applied? And you don't want to be there to test it immediately afterwards, but you would like to know how long the disinfectants were applied prior to sampling. Typically, the longer the better, because the longer it resides, the more effective it's going to be. And you also want to know about the concentrations that were applied. And there's a tendency for someone to think, more is better. Not necessarily when you're applying disinfectants, but more importantly, is there an opportunity for a curious attorney to delve into your methodology and find someone who was at the facility after they moved in, who had a scratchy throat, who had eye irritation, had rhinitis, something that was a potential consequence of the use of disinfectants. And I say this because after COVID, some of the research, I think the author was Chen, Chen, not Chin, in the paper, who describes some of the after thoughts of the application of extensive disinfectants for COVID. Now, whether or not they're effective viruses, I doubt it, but people were affected afterwards, and it created a liable circumstance for the applicant. And we wouldn't want that to happen to a restoration contractor by simply following the proper guidance for application, documenting training, and describing the qualifications of the person who applied the disinfectants.
Ralph, can I follow up here? What I like about your presentation, first, it's all science-based, but then secondly, a lot of this comes from your experience doing expert witness type work.
Right.
And I've got a text here that also said, yes, also licensing requirements if applicable. I'm wondering, has that ever come up in your expert witness work where, someone said, hey, you weren't properly licensed to use that product on this job?
The most frequent issue of licensing comes up in the use of infrared cameras where they haven't had proper training, and worse, they're using the images to describe the presence of moisture, not temperature. With regard to disinfectants, it depends upon the sophistication of the attorney. I think I've had it come up maybe once or twice.
It depends on the state. Some
True.
states, some
California.
states require it, other states don't. But
Right.
if I could comment a little bit,
Sure.
I think that having done a few of these projects over the course of my career, I've learned a couple of things about it. And what I found worked best was to rather than use a separate disinfectant, use a product that can simultaneously clean and disinfect. Therefore, you have chemical compatibility, and some of these products have a tendency to clean better than others, because in certain situations you may have oil residues or petroleum residues and so on and so forth that are also there. And you kind of want to remove that stuff as best you can. And I think, you're going to probably do multiple cleanings. I've also found that foam application works very, very well because it gives you dwell time, it clings. I found low pressure works probably better than high pressure to get into cracks and crevices. And depending on which product you use, you can get some residual activity out of these products, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks in terms of a bacteriostatic or fungistatic protection that allows thorough drying to occur, without any additional problems. But
so Cliff, you're thinking of a surfactant that has disinfectant properties, is that right? Or surfactant with a disinfectant?
Well, yeah, quats are surfactants that have disinfectant quality. So I think for a lot of these situations, I probably, would lean, more towards a quat than some of the others. And a lot of times the label is going to give you, the application instructions for if you're using it as a cleaner, if you're using it as a heavy duty cleaner, and so on and so forth. So I would tend to lean more towards quats. Some people, particularly out in California, other places like that, they tend to be anti-phenol, but I might be inclined to use a phenol product if I was dealing with a hospital, situation. But I think a lot of it's driven by, what do you think the worst organism there is? And try to use an antimicrobial. It's going to be effective on that particular organism.
Okay, very good. I was thinking that, well, I lost my train of thought. But in either case, the point is that the disinfectants are required, necessary, and also pose a responsibility. And so I think my point was this, is that whoever applies the disinfectants, that they have something written down in the plan that they were aware of the types of contaminants they had, and they had recognized that the appropriate concentration and instructions were read and documented. And that way, if it comes back 2 years later, they have something written down to say, yes, I was familiar with the application of that particular disinfectant. I read the instructions. It's documented in this this brief meeting we had prior to its application.
One other thing too that we would normally do is have the customer sniff test it. This is what it smells like. This is what your house is going to smell like. Your building is going to smell like for several hours after the application, so that they don't
freak out.
Yeah, they don't freak out. And I've seen people freak out, particularly with some of these botanical products that smell like thyme, and they're sold as being very, very safe and so on and so forth.
Right.
And, from an EPA standpoint, they are considered safe. However, they have an odor. And I've seen literally people freak out over it and litigation ensue because of it. So let the customer smell it first. It's a good thing.
Okay, well, let's move on.
Go to the next slide, Grayson.
Yeah. So the next area I thought was really curious was the area of sampling. And the present company accepted, Jeremy, but some of the industrial hygienists that have been on the opposite side of me have been very critical of the statistical analysis of the sample results from doing any type of testing. Was it numerically sound? Was it representative of the sample population and so forth? So I think the point is that, if you're going to engage in, and you will, in sampling, surface sampling with swab and tape and air and so forth, is try to get some agreement among your team as to an appropriate methodology. And I'll talk about that in a second. But the point is that this is one of the most common areas that are criticized, the representativeness of the sample results to express whether or not conditions are safe. And so since there are some both statistical and some judgmental methods to do this sampling, I think it's important for the PRV specialist to recognize there are some circumstances that are appropriate for both the judgmental and statistical methods of sampling, depending on, of course, the magnitude and the number of places he's got to sample. So let's go into that in the next slide. So this was taken from a paper that's referenced in the article, but there are probability methods of sampling. We recognize that simply as some as random sampling, which you've all done, or composite sampling, and non-probability sampling, which is really somewhat judgmental. So, for example, if you had a spill in a very particular location, rather than sampling an entire area or building, you say, well, I know where the spill was. I'm making a judgment. I'm going to go in this particular area and do my sampling. Whereas if, for example, you had a schoolroom that you thought there was some suspicion that the desks were 100 desks were contaminated with some bacterium or virus or contaminant, you might use probability saying, look, I'm going to do a random sample. I'm going to do maybe composite sampling. I won't sample all 100 desks, but during the course of my effort, I'll probably sample about 10 to 18 that are representative of the entire population. And I'll use that as a basis for my sampling strategy. So these are, again, are described in the paper. And the point is that both are good techniques. The bottom line is that if you are the PRV person, have some idea of how to defend your actions on which one you chose and where. So think about it rather than just take a couple tape lifts and think that you're on your way.
Ralph, let me jump in here for a second. I see we've got a text question. I want to kind of ask it in my own way. With respect to sampling, are you looking to verify that the area is safe, or are you looking to verify that the area is back to normal conditions? I guess is what I'm trying. Is it
Yeah.
a building related thing or a health related thing?
Well, it depends upon what side of the courtroom you're sitting on.
Okay.
If you were the opposing counsel, it would be definitely health-based. And there would be some argument as to the methodology. Was it reflective of the healthful conditions, and was it enough? If it's practical and you're going back to pre-loss conditions, that's an insurance term, pre-loss, is that the truth is that many of these areas that we return to, quote, normal, had some degree of contamination to begin with. And I was speaking with Richard Shaughnessy. He's doing some research right now on trying to define what is background, because it varies tremendously throughout the nation, depending upon the school or the bus stop or the theater or the museum. And I think that people will be surprised that what is background is actually kind of dirty. So the point is that these are elements of the PRV process that should be discussed before you get started or before you start sampling, so that all the parties understand the complications that are associated with trying to put numerical values on health or safety. And it's complicated. And that's what makes this process controversial and prone to criticism.
Okay, hopefully that answers your question, but if not, just let me know. Let's go to the next slide.
So there are a lot of methods to during the course of a PRV process. Tape lifts, auger stamps, which I never heard of until a few years ago when I was in court, polymerase chain, micrometers, and so forth. I don't think there's anything that's right or wrong about any particular methods. I think it really depends upon the circumstances. And since this is a general presentation, I think that's up to the discretion of the PRV specialist who's going to choose to sample. I think the important point is that if you were examined with regard to the representativeness and the method, would they be appropriate to help answer the question of, is it safe? Or in more serious circumstances, like a health-based facility, is it going to be protective of life and health in a medical laboratory, for example? So is it helpful for just back to normal, or is it also protective of health and safety? And those decisions that each of those methods can help to answer, some to more degrees than others. As I mentioned here, I think the way to protect yourself, and I'll admit that I'm kind of tainted. I'm always thinking about how you can be attacked, is I would look for publications that provide references that you can then use to defend your position on why you use different methods to sample.
We've got a comment spot on. Too many times we see no specific PRV criteria before the work starts, and that's not fair to the contractor. It makes it really tough for them to achieve whatever it is if they start off without knowing what their goal is. The other comment that I thought was important, and it kind of matched something I had already made a note on, Ralph. I'm guessing you would prefer that someone like Jeremy or yourself or one of your people was on the site at the start of the project and made periodic visits to the site during the project, as opposed to coming in at the end and trying to do a post-remediation verification.
I think that is probably the underlying theme of this whole paper, is that if you can't integrate the professional that's going to test the efficacy of the work throughout the process, is that he or she is walking into a black hole. And so you need to know what's going on, especially as the criteria for health and return to pre-loss conditions is elevated by certain clients. As I said, that the person who owns that medical lab has a different expectation than the one that owns the typing pool or the local pool. So yes, that's right on, and there should be integration from the beginning if possible. And if not, they need to take a moment and stand back for the PRV specialist and say, look, before I begin, tell me what you did. And so he has some introduction to what happened and how to proceed from there.
Okay, hey, we're at halftime. Let's stop and thank our sponsors, Grayson. We'll be back for the second half of our interview. We've got Jeremy Beagle and Dr. Ralph Moon talking about PRV on mold or on sewage, flood and sewage projects. IAQ Radio's marquee sponsor is the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification, IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry at iicrc.org. Our association sponsors are the Environmental Information Association. EIA's multidisciplinary membership collects, generates, and disseminates information concerning environmental and occupational health hazards in the built environment at eia-usa.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry, iicrc.org. The Restoration Industry Association, the oldest and largest nonprofit professional trade association dedicated to providing leadership and promoting best practices through advocacy, standards, and professional qualifications for the restoration industry at restorationindustry.org. Industry sponsors are Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. Tramex Meters, innovation in moisture detection and humidity monitoring systems since 1974 at tramexmeters.com. EMSL Analytical Inc., providing high-quality, full-service laboratory services since 1981. EMSL.com. All right, we're back to the second half of our interview. We've got Jeremy Beagle and Dr. Ralph Moon. Let's get back to the slideshow, Grayson, and let Dr. Moon continue. Here we go. Next slide.
Oh, I think we had this. Did you have this before?
Yes.
So this is
Yeah.
some sampling, but let's see the next slide. I wanted to give some simple examples. The audience is wide, and so this is an example of like probabilistic sampling, where you have sort of a uniform field of contamination, and you want to get some representative understanding of the potential for residual contamination. And so this could use a random table of numbers. You can see the numbers on the side. You pick two numbers, you intersect at a point, you take a sample there, and that way you get a probabilistic sampling methodology. And the two examples would be floodwaters across the floor or aerosolized particles introduced on walls, ceilings, or into a room. You could use that type of sampling. The point is that, when you choose these sampling designs, do it with the intention of defending your opinion. And in that case, that would be a defensible opinion for those two types of examples. Next slide.
Ralph, can I ask a quick question on that one?
Yeah.
At the 1-1, that X area, would that be the area where the loss occurred? So like it went from there and spread across the rest of the floor, or is this just, am I way off there?
Yeah. The 1-1 is not intended to represent a source, rather that the contaminant in this example, where you use this design, would be uniformly distributed. So, for example, if you had a flood that went across the entire floor relatively quickly, didn't reside in one corner and then move slowly, that would not be the circumstance you might use here. But where you have some random movement or distribution of the contaminant, that's where you'd use a probabilistic sampling methodology.
Thank you.
Okay.
Next.
So the next one is non-probabilistic. And this is where the PRV specialist is familiar with the contamination, and he's judging the location of sampling based upon his experience and knowledge of what happened. So if we had, for instance, a field, and I'm thinking back in another life when I was doing more soil contamination and groundwater contamination, but if the event happened in that upper left-hand corner where the truck fell over, whatever, then you knew from your judgment that's where you'd probably take the samples. You wouldn't use a random method because you'd have less frequency of detecting the contaminant, but you would use your judgment. And in our work, this type of work, where you're in unusual buildings and obstructions and inside framing and so forth, you may want to use your judgment, and you would be perfectly justified in doing that. So, as I mentioned here at the bottom of the slide, irregular contaminant locations, crawl spaces, those things where it may be difficult to access it uniformly, you have to use your judgment.
But be prepared to justify why you used your judgment.
It's all about defending your opinion, right? Defending your approach. And I think, if you have those two basic models in your head, either probabilistic or non-probabilistic or judgmental, I'll call it judgmental, and is that you can explain why, if there was a flood and the crawl space was flooded with sewage, why you didn't look at the samples on every particular location. You had a pretty good idea when you went in there and your elbows were in the sewage, that you could go only so far and get a realistic sample of the contaminant. So, in our work, we see all kinds of strange things, all kinds of messes, and you have to use judgment sometimes. And I think that most people understand that.
Very good. Next.
This was kind of interesting to me in that there is a hierarchy that has been published, not just related to contaminant losses, but in hospitals in particular. And there's a distinction in how you would approach high-touch surfaces as compared to low-touch surfaces. And high-touch surfaces are higher in the hierarchy of sampling than those are low-touch. And this came up in a conversation about cleaning schools, in that the stairwells, the handles, elevator buttons, doorknobs are all high-touch surfaces, but floors were not. I mean, you walk on it, but you don't necessarily sample or clean floors as often as high-touch surfaces, because they're not in intimate contact with the person. So in this case, there's a hierarchy in which you would, assuming that some of these high-touch surfaces are even still in the structure after you've done a PRV, because many are removed, right? A lot of instruments, sometimes doors are damaged and removed. So depending upon what is left after the remediation is completed, then you would select certain things and probably sample those high-touch surfaces more frequently than you would low-touch.
Ralph, would this also apply to where you would disinfect?
I think so, yeah. And I've heard that same argument in schools. So, for example, the school floor is cleaned once or twice a week, whereas desk surfaces, doorknobs, stairwells are done every day. So yes, that kind of makes sense to me.
Okay, next one. Next slide, Grace. There we go.
Okay, so here's a kind of a sampling hierarchy of the circumstances, some methods that you may use, and which ones are non-critical and critical. So the things that are not critical in a sampling hierarchy would be maybe floors and walls. I mean, no one's having too much intimate contact with the floors and walls, we hope. And with regard, though, to equipment that's used, especially in an analytical environment or maybe an office environment, if they're still there, and put a question mark there, because normally they're out. They're not, you don't keep that in during the course of a restoration effort. But if there's something like that, that would be more critical and would be hence sampled differently than a floor, closet, or wall. So
Okay.
that's one of the things that goes into the thinking of defending your position. If, for example, you chose not to sample an area or not very frequently, you say, well, I think it was low touch and it was not critical. And I chose not to do that as frequently as some of the high touch critical areas of the project. And I think that's a nice rationale to substantiate how you chose certain frequencies and sampling methods.
Next.
This is really interesting. And years ago, I was at I think it was an IICRC conference in Philadelphia, and I'd written a paper on cleaning mold fabrics. And the second speaker spoke about sewage losses, and he asked the audience, how many of you have taken furniture or contents home after a sewage loss
Yep.
that the homeowner didn't want? The whole room raised their hands. They found a reason. I mean, it's just, if you're just practical in life, the fact there's a 1/4 inch of discoloration at the base of a very nice piece of furniture, you can clean that. But to the homeowner, that was totally unacceptable. But the point is that salvage contents often find their way in different directions when you have these types of circumstances. And the challenge is not that they may not be thrown out or they may serve a useful purpose, is the potential liability that someone who takes it home then 2 years later says, hey, I took that dresser home, I took that phone home, and I got sick afterwards. I think that, you didn't really manage your project correctly. Now, that may seem extreme, but in our world of liability, it's not extreme. It could happen. So the point is straightforward. If you're going to have valuable contents that are going to be salvaged or have a different life after the event, document it. Let them, you take the dresser home, great, tell me, let's write this down, because you're responsible for it. If it's returned back to the same structure, then document on who cleaned it, what methodology, so it doesn't have the tendency to be interpreted as recontaminating the environment after an excellent remedial strategy. So those are details that tend to evolve about 18 months after a project that can cause you headaches. But the point is that if you realize the potential for that to come back, then address it up front. Okay, gentlemen, I appreciate all your work in this famous Oriental rug factory, but I know the homeowner or the owner is going to get insurance payment for all those rugs, but you can't take them home. Or you can take those home if it goes through a cleaning method we approve and you pay for, something like that. So the idea is that the disposition of these contents they have another life expectancy potentially. And you want to make sure that, you're not tagged with it, 18 to 24 months later.
Go to the next one, Grayson.
So these are my closing thoughts, is that I think that for me, and again, I'm in kind of a litigious environment all the time, but I'm thinking that it's best to control potential disputes up front by forming a little team or getting together for a meeting with the interested parties and talk about the expectations of the project. More importantly, what are the expectations that you're going to offer on what's acceptable? And if you can talk that through and resolve them, sometime at the early stage of the project, I think you're in a much better position than if you just try to discuss it at the end. With regard to sampling, I think that be prepared to defend your position. as well as high touch, low touch, low critical, critical, non-critical, and is it are they using methods that are statistically defensible? If you can use statistics, depending upon the circumstances of the loss and the area you're sampling, perfect. Use those to describe it. If you can't, use judgment and explain why. And finally, the biggest thing I derived at writing this paper is that there's a lot of um, importance placed upon the person who serves as the PRV specialist. There's incredible discretion on their part. And so it's important that we understand the intent and the qualifications and the thinking that goes on in organizing your idea of approaching a PRV properly. So at the end, you have limited disputes and limited controversy as to the findings and the results and interpretation of the cleanup.
All right, let's first, before we go to the roundup, Jeremy, I want to let you jump in here and make any comments you have, and then Cliff.
Yeah, I think overall I agree a lot with what Ralph was saying. I think one of the biggest the hardships with PRV is the over reliance on sampling. Generally, when we look at what literature, what everything says, we need to, one of the most important things that Ralph was saying was at the beginning, which is actually doing your objective survey, is collecting data. Is it clean? Is it dry? Getting these measurements, confirm what work was done, what was supposed to be done, and then what was done. So particularly when we look at sewage, because what is the definition of clean? Like we were saying before, it's different everywhere. What are we looking for? Are you doing, presence absence for, coliforms, fecal coliforms, and E. coli? Because they're, coliforms are found everywhere. It's generally background. E. coli doesn't really last that long on a surface. It could be days, maybe a week or so. So what are you looking at? What was typically there? And then if you are culturing bacteria, is that bacteria that we typically find? Because, as Ralph pointed out, you do find things on surfaces. It's everywhere. So when it comes to, at least a lot of times when I'm dealing with this, looking at the information, even pre-remediation, just the work that's been done out there. I took a swab, I found this. Well, that doesn't actually mean that it came from that source. Can you back it up to that? And then what is clean? Can we find that elsewhere? I think that's one of the struggles with sampling, and there really isn't anything health-based yet to show. So if you want to look at efficacy of the disinfection, that's fine. There are ways to do that, and that can be useful. So I think you have to be mindful of the PRVs have to be focused on the objective part of this, of the visual observations, the moisture measurements, making sure they did the work correct, whether it's sewage, whether it's mold, whether it's anything. And then if you are going to rely on sampling, as Ralph has pointed out, like you do have to understand these limitations. And is that information actually telling you that? One of the biggest things with PRV that's shown over my 22 years is a lot of times I'm walking into properties that have been remediated well after as part of litigation. And I find that it was not done correctly. The area that was remediated is dirty. There's contaminated building material still there. And then I go to the property, I'm like, hey, just so you know, this wasn't done. Oh yeah, it was. They gave me this, they took a sample and said it was remediated. Sampling can't tell you that remediation was completed. It can help support in certain aspects, but we just have to make sure that we understand, what those limitations are and does it fit with everything we see. I think that's always one of my biggest takeaways with PRV, and even looking at this one, particularly with sewage, because everybody focuses on bacteria, but there are other things in the water as well. Why are we not sampling for those? Why are we not looking for different things? It becomes very complicated. But what isn't complicated is showing the work was done correctly and that it was cleaned. That's my 5 cents on that.
I would just like to ask you guys a couple of questions. What would be your opinion on using a bacteriostatic or fungistatic treatment, as a final treatment? And, a lot of money ends up being spent on these projects, and they don't remain sterile, and they never were sterile for very, very long.
Right.
And so the question is, would you be in favor of that type of treatment? A stat or that would provide some sort of long-term protection. Just a question.
So I'll answer that because that's something I'm wrestling with in the SDII committee. What's clean and what is normal. The application of that fungostat or bacteriostat may have, to me, appropriate applications under certain circumstances. I think if there are some pharmaceutical areas that were damaged, medical facilities, some food areas, I think those might be an appropriate final application to assure safety and health. But if I was working in a bus stop or a gas station or many homes I've been into, applying that final polish would probably provide protection for about 3 hours, and then it would return back to where it was before. So I think one of the questions that we have about what's safe has to be linked to the environment that we've attempted to return it back to normal. And in many cases, as Jeremy mentioned, the presence of E. coli and other bacteria is so prominent. To think that we can stabilize an environment with disinfectants after a PRV is really, it's ridiculous, because we know it has a half-life of going back to where it was measured in minutes or hours.
Yeah, nobody learned this. We learned this in COVID. Everybody was they were fogging, they were cleaning, and then as soon as you open the door and somebody comes back in, you're back to, most of the population does not live in a sterile environment. We live in an environment where all these things are around. Now, we should have good housekeeping, good residential hygiene, things like that to keep us, but this stuff will be around. So focusing, doing that extra generally isn't going to be necessary. I saw in a comment here, it talks about it being dry. Why do we need to do anything? That's right. We remove the moisture. If we remove the moisture, most of these biologicals are not going to, they're going to die. So we've done it. If we clean, we disinfect it, remove the moisture, we should be good for most of the population.
Okay. Yeah. I like that, and that answers, I think, Ed's question. Let's go to the roundup, Grayson. Unless Cliff, you wanted to one more.
I just had one more question, which can be my roundup question, actually. I sent both of you some stuff I had written back in like 2006 or 2007, yes. Pittsburgh Protocol stuff, and I just wondered if you could comment on it. It tended to work back then, and I still recommend it now. And you guys are looking at it from a different perspective. I'm going in first and doing that, and you're coming in afterwards, and just
Well, yeah, I had read that before, because I asked about it, I think maybe a year ago or so. And Cliff, your ideas are very practical, and I think and they're effective. So I don't have any disagreement with it or with its simplicity. I like simple, I like practical, I like quick. All those things make sense. Now, will they make sense in a court of law? I don't know. Have you been challenged in the courtroom with that technique?
I suspect maybe some people have been challenged with it. I personally haven't been challenged with it. It ended up going into some FEMA documents and things like that, where it was recommended and so on and so forth. But their documents change from time to time as well.
In my understanding of it, Cliff, it's more of a wet method, right?
I'm sorry?
It's more of a wet method versus vacuuming and sanding.
Oh yeah, no, it's
right.
It's definitely a wet method, and one of the reasons that we were trying to use the heavy duty type cleaning products is to deal with removing, oils and other types of chemicals that that may be there, and trying to consider that as well. But
it makes sense because you're hitting a larger area with much less time. And I think as long as it's dried after the fact, you should be good.
Well, the other thing, when it was used in this church project, we actually were able to determine that how much water was actually used. It was measured and so on and so forth. So it ended up being quite a low moisture
Because you said you
frost.
foamed, right? It foamed.
Pardon me?
It
Well, yeah,
foamed.
we foamed and then pressure,
Yeah,
we
like
foamed
you
it on,
said.
then
Yep.
pressure cleaned it. Because nothing else worked. And we tried the HEPA vacuuming and so on and so forth. There was just too much mold
Right. You
there.
get that
But
dwell time with the foam, like you
Right.
talked about earlier in the presentation,
Right.
which was that's exactly what I thought. It's like the foam, if you get to the dwell time, it's gonna take care of the surfaces.
right. But I mean, people do some crazy stuff. Like I know people that would reflood it. They'll flood it with a disinfectant solution and try to leave it there for 8 hours or 12, 24 hours or something like that in order to, try to deal with the cement and so on and so forth, which I think is, I think going overboard. And I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that's going to do a whole lot of good, but yeah.
All right. Well, let's go to the roundup there, Grayson. The roundup brought to us by Tramex Meters at tramexmeters.com. Let's bring in the restoration industry's global watchdog, Pete Consigli. Hello, Pete.
Hey, Joe, how's it going?
Well,
So,
good to
as,
have you.
as usual, Ralph is just, good job, Ralph.
Thank you.
I've come to expect that. The bar is set very high for you, Dr. Moon. So, you have to constantly keep striving to make sure to get over the bar, that you don't catch your cojones on the barbed wire, because that's really very painful. But listen, Ralph, so I have a question for you. In writing this paper and developing these protocols, how would you how would you actually compare the data and the research you did for this paper versus the ATP one, where you talked about the use and the misuse of ATP? And before you answer, let me qualify that, because ATP was first introduced into the industry in the 1990s to be used as some kind of testing and quality assurance for dealing with sewage backups. Then it evolved and people wanted to use it for mold, and then it just got out of hand. I mean, that essentially comes from the food industry, for determining cleanliness standards on hard surfaces like metal tables, things of that nature. So here we are, now 35, 40 years later, of the industry monkeying around with the ATP, and now the sewage issue is a big thing. I mean, the sewage actually hit our industry before all this general water stuff. The very first thing to actually be published on sewage was in the late 80s, early 90s. It was a combined paper with the EPA and a bunch of restoration folks that ultimately became Category 3 in the first S500. But then in 1994, the sewage backflow paper was published in the Journal of Environmental Health with Gene Cole and Berry, and there was a number of people in our industry that were on that also. And anyway, so now here we are. That was long before ANSI and everything else. So just talk about where we're at with the whole thing, because just look at some of the different people who came in on the chat. They're pro this, they're not against that. And why do we need to do it? Where's the literature? Where do you quote it? I like the practical aspect that you look at it for. It depends on the attorney, depends on the situation. There's a lot of factors beyond just the science only that determines what you do. So why don't you talk to that a little, Ralph? And Cliff will take notes and put it in the blog.
Yeah, I think I probably got 30 seconds to answer your question, but first of all, I think that ATP is an excellent tool. And where I would use it in these circumstances are high-touch, critical surfaces. And I would also use it in circumstances where the potential frequency of returning back to pre-loss condition is slow, meaning medical areas where there food and pharmacy, where the frequency of cleaning and general surface cleanliness is high. But with regard to use of ATP in a general sense, I think that other techniques are more practical for that. If it's tape lift or swab or other types of micrometer, those are fine for that. But I would use the ATP in high touch, critical, frequently cleaned areas where the presence or absence of microbes is really helpful to know, but less helpful, I would not apply in areas where they're going to return to fairly dirty conditions within hours or days.
Okay.
Okay. So, Jeremy, what kind of thoughts do you have as a CIH and a building investigator and the use of these different things available when you have to do some kind of either quality assurance testing or some kind of clearance criteria?
Well, it's like I said before, I'm not a fan of sampling in general for that because we're not going to get enough samples. We don't know really what we're sampling for. Although I think I would disagree a little bit with Ralph. If you are going to use something and we're just going to show efficacy and the surface is clean, well, ATP may be useful, depending on what kind of surface it is that you are sampling. That might be, if you have a luminometer already, it's going to be a relatively cheap and quick way to kind of determine that a surface is cleaned. But I still harp and stand on the fact of the physical inspection is most important, because generally once that containment comes down, we're back to the rest of the property. Nobody's generally looking at that. Nobody's thinking about those other areas. So again, if you're gonna use it, you have to be able to show why you used it, how you used it, and what it's telling. I think what generally we see, because we're involved in so many of these, contentious matters, is that most of the information that's being collected just isn't enough to support that opinion, whether it's before or after the cleaning.
I just want to check in, Ralph. Do you have to leave, or can you stick around another couple minutes?
Oh, I can stick around, sure.
Okay, good. Let's
Joe?
go, Pete.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. No. Pete said something, and I'd like to get Dr. Moon's opinion on it and Jeremy's opinion on it. Sometimes things find their ways into our industry standards that I think may be mythical or magical, in nature. And one of the things that's found its way into the standard is this deterioration of water from category 2 to category 3. And, it would seem to me that, these organisms need more than just the presence of moisture in order to replicate and increase their population levels. So do you think that really happens? The fact, it seems to me that, when it first came out, I think this standard reflected that it was going to, before they had good definitions for category 2 and category 3, they used to say, well, over time, over this time period, water is going to turn from having fecal or not having fecal matter in it to having fecal matter in it, because that was originally the definition of this category 3 water. It was water, before the trap and so on and so forth.
All right.
So
I'll say this, is that I don't believe that the water tends to accumulate fecal coliform with time.
right.
I will say, though, that with our research on wood, on some metal products, and also on the metal products and flooring, when we expose those to moisture, we started out with clean tap water. In some cases, I think even made of distilled, but within the course of about 3 or 4 days, it changed radically from a visible point of view. And within a week, it was full of fungi and bacteria. Now, we had to change the water out, but it was remarkably fast, Cliff, and I was surprised at that. But I think the key was it was in some cases, highly oxygenated water as well. So that may have sped up the rate of encouraging microbial growth. But for example, the flooring materials, I mean, they were cleaned with acetone or with isopropyl alcohol, placed on a concrete shelf and then wetted. And within a matter of really, I think the dates show day 3, 4, 5, and 6, they all got moldy within that quick. With regard to the mold growth on cabinet materials from OSB, plywood, solid wood, interior, exterior plywood, they all got moldy within a week. And the water changed visibly. I think I ran everything through a 0.2 micron filter, and then it was beautifully clear. and within about a week, it was cloudy and supporting mold growth. So it changed.
I guess what my question would be is these materials that you were testing, are they in some sort of sealed environment?
No,
No. Okay,
they're
so
not.
they're exposed to the air, correct?
Yes, they
Okay,
are.
all right.
Because in our world, we don't live in sealed environments,
Okay.
Now, if and I'm not sure the value of doing that type of test in a sealed environment only as a control, but for me, in a normal either home, office, or outdoor environment, they begin contaminated pretty quickly.
Thank you.
Okay. Cliff,
So,
any more
well,
questions? Or should
No,
we
I'm
turn
good.
it over
I'm
to
good.
Pete?
I'm
Let's
good.
go to Pete.
yeah,
We'll wrap this up with Pete.
so listen, in the early to mid 90s, when I was active contractor in Northern California, I did dozens of sewage claims that many of them were not covered by insurance, but they were covered by different governments in Northern California under kind of a good neighbor policy. And we'd work with the early pioneers in this, guys like David Bierman, Peter Sirk, those kinds of people. And because the homeowners who were claimants, not insureds, they were claimants with the city because there was no insurance coverage. They wanted some insurance. And what we figured out, we worked back then, we tried a number of things. They used to recommend Clorox back in the day, but Cliff, you don't need to comment on that. We know Clorox is, wasn't good for that. We used all different kinds of biocide type treatments. We even experimented with hydrogen peroxide that had issues. Isopropyl alcohol, we use that for a lot of disinfection, all the stuff, some of the things that Ralph talked about. But what we found out on the concrete surfaces and wood surfaces, after you gutted and had to do demo when you had really bad sewage like that, before they would put them back together when everything was dry, we realized that what these third-party inspectors looked for back then to provide some clearance criteria, and this is 35, 40 years ago, even before ATPA hit the ATP was present in our market, they did tape lifts and what they were looking for, and they would send stuff to the lab. They were looking for E. coli or the coliform bacteria. E. coli, of course, if there was high humidity, you're going to get it. But the coliform bacteria, they established their own criteria that if in the affected area they found even one, it's kind of like the asbestos protocol. You can't find one particle, they go back and clean. And that's what we did until they were done. And basically, it was a trial and error. We shared that with a lot of industry meetings, and then the standards weren't even developed then, and then they started to evolve and they developed. But sometimes, like Cliff says, these groups get together and they overthink stuff and they go too far, or they have some bad science in there, oftentimes too. But so I think all these years later, I'm not so sure that what we did then isn't a lot of the stuff that's kind of practical and being done now. We were fortunate that we had the trial and error flexibility in order to try to do the right thing and make these properties clean and safe so that the people, would settle the claims with the cities or counties, whoever was ultimately going to accept the liability. And anyway, so that's that. And anyway, gentlemen, I appreciate, the paper, Ralph and Jeremy, and the time you put into it. And I think this is a good primer. Last week we had Ken Sider's talk. This week we have Ralph's. They're going to be on the winter break program. And they use it kind of as a testing, so they get a little bit of feedback so they can refine it when they're going to, be ready for prime time, if you would. And, Ralph, Jeremy, you guys have chatted over with some of the input you've gotten back from some very highly credible people that are on the chat log today, and maybe make a few little changes or modifications just for the discussion. And I'm looking forward to, to seeing the finished presentation from a beta to the final presentation next February in Florida. So thank you for all the hard work on that. And Mr. Radio Joe and my buddy the Z-Man and Gone Fishing Grayson there, and Ralph and Jeremy, I'll turn it back over to you. It was a good technical show where we got at the issues. We had different viewpoints, and that makes for a great podcast.
Thank you, Pete. Much appreciated. Before we go, we'd like to give you guys the last word. Any final thoughts, Ralph? We'll start with you.
There was some talk about high-touch surfaces. I had the opportunity to look at a fertility clinic that had a roof leak in one corner of the building. I did swab testing on the little buttons that were used for the laboratory. They're really critical not to be contaminated with fungi, and they all had fungal contamination. So the idea of looking at high-touch surfaces with either a swab or with ATP, I think is helpful depending upon the circumstances.
And Jeremy, final thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I think it's to get everybody to agree on a criteria, or if you are the professional that's creating the requirements for doing the protocol or whatever it may be, that you do specify what your requirements are, and then everybody can agree on them. I think that's really important walking into any of these matters.
All right. Cliff?
Joe, if I might, Pete, that this zero tolerance scares me.
I'm just telling you, that's what the guy said.
I understand, and I think we've all lived through zero tolerance for one spore Stachybotrys, and seen, what that did to restoration contractors and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with you, Cliff. I'm just reporting the news. It's history. I didn't feel comfortable, but we actually met the criteria. It was my point. It wasn't
easy.
I
understand.
Yeah.
All right, this is Radio Joe Hughes saying thanks to this week's guests, Dr. Ralph Moon and Jeremy Beagle. I also want to thank our audience for the great comments and great discussion in the chat log. Ed, definitely we'll have to get you back, and maybe you can present that Johnson paper again. I also want to thank my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick, Grayson, Gone Fishing Fisher at the controls, and of course the Restoration Global Watchdog, Pete Consigli. Next week we've got an interesting show. Luis Suarez, we're going to talk a little bit about helping grow that Latino workforce, and he's the first, I think, if Cliff would correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's the first guy doing IICRC courses multilingual.
No, there's been a
doing
couple
that.
people that have done it.
There have?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll be back next week. We've got Luis coming in to join us, and this is Radio Joe saying thanks to this week's guests, and we'll see you next Friday at noon for the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.